You've confirmed a pattern of corporate misconduct. The evidence? It's real. But here's the critical question. Is your investigation actually over, or is your organization just faking its recovery? Welcome to our explainer on the recovery protocol. Today, we're going to examine exactly why so many organizations completely fail to repair the underlying systems that produce misconduct in the first place.
Okay, let's dive right into this briefing structure. We'll start with the fake remediation trap, move on to real recovery using the Volkswagen benchmark, and then break down the 7-stage recovery protocol. After that, we'll cover calibrating your evidence, the limitations of AI analysis, and finally, concrete actions for true recovery.
Section 1. The fake remediation trap, or the illusion of recovery.
Think about it. You've confirmed the misconduct. But is the investigation actually over, or is the organization just faking its recovery? You see, a lot of organizations announce an issue is fully resolved just because a report was filed and an anomaly was found. But here's the hard truth. Identifying what happened is significantly easier than dismantling the system that actually allowed it to happen.
Before you confirm a problem, your objective is purely epistemic. You're just trying to figure out if the problem is even real. But after confirmation, the objective fundamentally shifts. Detection asks, what happened? Recovery, on the other hand, asks, what must change so it cannot continue unnoticed? These are entirely different disciplines. Finding the failure? Well, that just highlights the problem. Actually dismantling the architecture that enabled that failure? That is the real work of recovery.
Predictably, remediation often turns into corporate theater. Organizations tend to fake recovery in 3 very specific ways. First, they remove the person, but preserve the system. Listen, replacing an employee inside the exact same architecture just produces a vacancy, not a recovery. The bad incentives and broken access permissions, they're still sitting right there. Second, they publish a policy, but preserve the behavior. A generic compliance workshop or a new sign-off document doesn't change the fact that informal, backdoor approvals might still be faster, or that raising concerns still derails careers. And third, they close the case before testing the fix. Installing a new control means absolutely nothing if nobody waits around long enough to see if exceptions are actually logged or if the pattern just happens again.
Moving on to Section 2, Real Recovery, the Volkswagen benchmark.
The regulatory response did not stop with identifying affected vehicles or imposing a financial penalty. The remedy had to address the actual harm. This principle right here is the absolute foundation of real recovery. You simply cannot find your way out of a structural defect, and you cannot policy write your way out of physical or financial harm.
And this brilliantly illustrates what measurable remediation actually looks like in practice. Just look at the logic of the settlement structure from the Volkswagen emissions case. The repair directly matches the harm. It connects the specific failure to the affected population, applies a concrete corrective action like buybacks and technical modifications, and then requires independent verification from regulators. But most importantly, it establishes severe financial consequences for non-performance. If they missed their 85% recall target, they were hit with massive additional penalties. This wasn't just a PR announcement. It was an independently tested operational standard.
Section 3. The 7-stage recovery protocol.
So, how does this build into a repeatable methodology? Here is the core framework, the blueprint necessary to move an organization from merely detecting a problem to achieving true structural recovery. It's a 7-stage protocol: contain, preserve, scope, diagnose, assign accountability, repair, and validate. Remember, recovery is a continuous operating process. It requires moving through these stages methodically. If you skip a stage, you essentially guarantee that the underlying risk will survive your investigation.
Let's break these down. Phase 1 involves containment, preservation, and scoping. Yes, you have to stop the exposure, but you absolutely cannot destroy the evidence needed to understand it in the process. Think about it. A rushed account deletion or a quick system reset might temporarily stop a breach, but it simultaneously wipes out the logs and metadata you need for the investigation. Once things are preserved, you have to scope the pattern. Never assume the first discovered event was actually the first occurrence. The recovery perimeter has to follow the evidence, even if it crosses departments, legal entities, or vendor relationships. It follows the data, not your organizational chart.
Phase 2 requires diagnosis and accountability. You can't just stop at saying, well, an employee violated a policy. You have to dig into the enabling conditions. Were their targets completely unrealistic? Could the controls be easily overridden? From there, accountability has to follow documented evidence, authority, and responsibility. We really have to avoid jumping to automatic collective blame here.
We must clearly differentiate between direct action, willful blindness, negligent supervision, and control ownership.
Finally, Phase 3 focuses on repair and validation. You've got to repair the records, the controls, the incentives, and crucially, the harm done to the affected parties. But here's the catch. Repair is completely meaningless without validation. A control is not validated just because it exists in a shiny new manual somewhere. No, it's validated when independent evidence shows it holds up under pressure. We're talking active bypass attempts, stringent exception monitoring, and independent transaction sampling.
Which brings us to Section 4, calibrating your evidence, fact versus retaliation.
So, the crucial point is strictly defining these 5 layers of evidence. If you don't properly calibrate your evidence, accountability quickly degrades into corporate retaliation. You start with an observable artifact, like a physical document, then an authenticated technical fact, like a verified unaltered system log. Next is an analytical inference, a logical conclusion drawn directly from those facts. Then comes an unresolved hypothesis, what you suspect is happening but cannot yet prove. And finally, a legal determination. Investigators must never cross the line from finding a pattern of facts into acting as a prosecutor making legal determinations. Always stick to exactly what the evidence actually proves.
Section 5, limitations of AI analysis and human accountability.
This brings us to the technological tools used in modern investigations. Look, artificial intelligence is incredibly powerful. It accelerates recovery by clustering related transactions, reconstructing complex timelines, and mapping relationships across massive datasets. It's exceptionally useful for expanding analytical coverage. But that is exactly where it should stop. Organizations must never outsource human accountability to a machine. An AI should never independently decide who acted intentionally, it shouldn't assess witness credibility, determine who gets disciplined, or declare that remediation is officially complete.
Because of these limitations, the language you use to report on your recovery must be strictly defensible. You have to avoid indefensible, sweeping guarantees like, "The problem is completely eliminated," or "No other cases exist." To be blunt, the evidence rarely, if ever, supports that kind of absolute certainty. Instead, use defensible language that describes exactly the work completed. Something like, "The control weakness was remediated and independently tested across the defined review period." Only promise what the data can actually guarantee.
Section 6, actions for true recovery, operational takeaways.
As we wrap up, let's translate this analytical framework into clear, operational takeaways for your own corporate governance. Here are 3 practical actions you can take immediately. 1. Define strict closure criteria before declaring victory. Remember, closure does not mean absolute certainty. It just means the remaining risk is understood, monitored, and proportionate. 2. Establish accountability using that 5-layer evidence matrix. Ensure every single action is tied to an authenticated fact, not just an unresolved hypothesis. And 3. Validate that the system actually behaves differently under pressure. Independent testing is literally your only proof of true recovery.
I'm leaving you with this final critical question to evaluate your own environment. When misconduct is found and the dust finally settles, does your organization learn in its architecture or only in its language? Because real recovery means structural change. Anything less is just waiting for the exact same pattern to repeat.
Simvansky Labs and Research. Forensics over fiction.